I'm really curious what your knowledge might be of international details and demographics. Does anybody know? Can you just take a shot at this? How many of you could guess a couple of countries that are among the top 10 most wealthy countries, most wealthy nations per capita in the world? Anybody know? Can anybody take a shot? America? George, I see your hand. What do you think? Qatar, number one. That's Qatar. Good job, George. Who else? Denmark. Let me consult. Close, number 16. Singapore. Somebody said Singapore. Yeah, it's among the top 10. Britain is not. They're way down there, believe it or not. 26, United Kingdom. United Arab Emirates, yeah. Oil rich, yeah. Dubai. Yeah, that isn't, yep. Dubai, it's there. In the UAE. Somebody said Liechtenstein, good. Here's another question then. Here you go. So Qatar, Macau, Luxembourg, Singapore, Brunei, believe it or not, Ireland, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Switzerland, and San Marino. The U.S. is number 13. Could anybody tell me, this is from the National Institutes of Health, what are the countries with the highest rates of anxiety? Qatar. Number one. United Arab Emirates, another. It's interesting to me because the assumption is the more we have, the more resource that we have, the more stuff that we have, the less we have to worry, the less cause we would have to worry. But what has been proven, I mean, from anything from sales of antidepressants, which is a pretty measurable metric, to suicide rates, which is a pretty measurable metric, those things point to the fact and prove that the wealthier we are, and again, this is not wealth per nation, this is wealth per person in those nations. The more that we have, the more we worry, the more anxious we are. And America has been dubbed one of the most worried nations in the world. Worry and anxiety is a part of our culture. Anxiety disorders in the U.S. affect over 40 million adults age 18 and older. Anxiety disorders affect over 25% of U.S. teenagers ages 13 to 18. And one of the things that they believe, one of the correlations that they're pointing to is that mom and dad's anxiety in the home is bleeding down. It's kind of leaking down and affecting the culture within those homes because they're arguing in front of their kids about stuff that the kids should not have to worry about. People who suffer from anxiety are 3 times to 5 times more likely to go to the doctor and 6 times more likely to be hospitalized, to be admitted once they're there. In the 1990s, high school students, from the 1990s on, high school students began to sleep less, worry more, and then as the world of internet search has kind of bloomed in front of us in the last couple of decades, we've seen high school-aged kids searching more and more about how to battle anxiety, how to think about it, how to deal with it. From 1999 to 2017, the suicide rate in America rose over 33%. One of the most worried nations in the world. And it's interesting to note that the correlation, the connection between wealth, resource, have, and what we have or don't have, versus anxiety. What we worry about, what we think about, what we cling to, what we fear losing, or what we fear not having. Look in your text in Luke chapter 12. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 821. Just look in your text for just a moment. Let me give you a little glimpse, one of the key words that's going to pop up in our text today is this. Look at verse 22, where Luke writes, therefore, this is capturing the words of Jesus, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or your body, what you will put on. And then skip down to verse 29. He says, do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink. These are practical resources, right? Things that you think that we should, because we've got enough, we shouldn't be worrying about. Do not seek what you are to eat or what you are to drink, nor be worried. Be worried. And the word, it's interesting, the word that he uses here in verse 29, this word for worried, literally is the word meteorize in the Greek language. The word meteor is the root word because it's this idea of like just skyrocketing, getting out of control, being lifted up in such a way that you're kind of out of your mind and consumed by this thing. Don't be worried. So let's read. I want to read this full text, and I want you to know that there's such hope for us in these words of our Savior Jesus, because he helps us wrestle through this dynamic of what you have and how you think about it, and how we worry, why our hearts worry, and what the solution is to that worry, to that anxiety. So let's start with verse 13, and we're going to read all the way through to the end of verse 34. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.' And he said to his disciples, 'Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, nor have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? Do not seek what you are to eat, what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is God's word. So there are some great and well-known phrases in this passage that are, sometimes we even grab these and pull them out of context, but they're worth memorizing and kind of pressing into our own hearts, and we'll do that this morning. But last week we saw how Jesus was addressing the disciples about fear, specifically about the fear of man, like fear of other people, your relationship to other people, and how we can tend to feel like other people have a certain power over us, and so we, out of fear for other people, we tend to live in lives of fear. And things were heating up for the disciples because things were heating up for Jesus, right? He was just teaching in the last chapter, in the end of chapter 11, and being vehemently opposed by the Pharisees and the scribes. And so they're watching this happen. The disciples are watching this happen and thinking, gosh, if they're coming after him, they're gunning for him, and I'm his disciple, I'm following after him. He's my teacher. If this is happening to him, it's going to happen to me. If I'm going to start teaching the message that he's teaching, it's going to happen to me. If I start living the life that he's living, this is going to happen to me. And so Jesus is turning to them and trying to prep them for this part of their life. Like, this is going to get rough. This is going to get hard. And it's worth it. Don't give up. Be faithful, and this is why. So last week he talks about the fear of man. And he's, right, if you remember this, basically he says, all they can do is kill you. Which sounds absurd to us. But he says, that's all they can do is take your temporary tent of a body. But there's more to you than that. And here in this passage, he starts talking to them about hoisting anchor from this passing world. He talks to them about not being too attached to the things that are hollow and temporary. He doesn't say that life is meaningless, that this life and this world and your body are meaningless. No, he says, you are more than this. And so in this passage, in verse 32, Jesus makes this really tender statement. I want to just focus in on this for just a moment before we get back to the beginning of the passage. He gives them this command. He cares for them, even in the way he addresses them as this little flock, which is this great Old Testament term. If you hear this, it makes you think of the prophets, where they would address Israel, God's people, as this little flock, this fragile people, this tender term, tender address. He talks to them as this little flock. And it captures the heart of the entire passage. It captures the kind of the posture of the heart that we're supposed to have. So I think it's important. Look at this. He says in verse 32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. A couple of questions like immediately spring to mind when I read this. But the main question I want to ask for now is, what is the threat in verse 32? What's he talking about that he's saying, this is what you're afraid of? What is that threat that Jesus says, fear not, little flock? What are they in danger of fearing? Right? What is it that is a threat to their faith? And you can find the answer right in the context that we just read. If you go back a few verses, the thing that they're in danger of fearing is the call to give up living like the world. Stop gunning after all the same things that the world is gunning for. Stop pursuing those things. The world pursues these things. Stop pursuing those things. Don't be afraid to give up that pursuit. And if we actually focus on the kingdom and stop pursuing things and ease and security, one of the questions that kind of rises in our own hearts is well, what do you mean? If I give that up, if I give up my stuff, will I be happy? Will I be provided for? Will I have what I want? Will I have what I need? If I give up that pursuit, am I going to have what makes me feel safe? And then Jesus says, fear not, little flock. Don't be afraid to stop pursuing these things. But if you go forward in the context, a couple of verses, and just one verse, to verse 33, the thing that they're in danger of fearing is giving things away. Verse 33 says, sell your possessions. Give to the needy. Don't be afraid to let go. Don't be afraid to give it away. Now, what does Jesus know? What does Jesus know that would motivate him to say, listen, I get something you don't get. I see the world in a certain way that you don't see it. What does Jesus know that we need to know in order to have the hope that he's telling us is there for us? What does he know that we don't know in order for us to have the security that is right here for us in these lines? What does he understand that we need to learn? In this passage, verses 13 to 34, Jesus gives us, I see, 3 compelling reasons not to be afraid to give it away. And they build one on another, so let's look at them. So here's the main point. Don't be afraid to give it away. Don't be afraid to give it away. That's the main point. Number 1, because your life is more than your temporary things. Because your life is more than your temporary things. Look, so Jesus is teaching, and it appears, right, in verse 13, it appears that this man interrupts this teaching with this personal family matter. In verse 13, he says, someone in the crowd said to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to the man, and that's not like dude. This is a common address to somebody else that he doesn't know. Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? And it's not that Jesus doesn't care about justice, about doing the right thing. It's not that these details are insignificant. Every detail is important. But Jesus sees through the man's request. He knows what's at the heart of this. So here's the background. According to the law of that day, the firstborn male child would inherit 2/3 of the deceased father's estate. And then the secondborn, the next down, would inherit 1/3 of that estate. And so apparently this man didn't get his share. And what's interesting to note is that he doesn't ask Jesus, if you notice, he doesn't ask Jesus to judge fairly. He asks Jesus to automatically side against his brother, right? And so he says, get me my money, get me my share. God, like, in other words, it's kind of like if he's talking to the Lord, he's talking to God, it's almost like a prayer saying, God, give me what I deserve. Give me what is due me. Give me what is my right, right? So how often do we mask, it makes me wonder, how often do we mask our covetousness, our greed, by convincing ourselves that this is my right. I deserve this thing. This is owed to me. This is life. This is the right thing. This is necessary. And I've worked hard for it. It's owed to me. I worked hard for this thing, therefore I deserve it. So Jesus uses this man's request to speak directly to him, and then he kind of turns it, and it shows us he turns to the crowd as well. Verse 15 it says, and he said to him, it changes the person. It says, he said to them, to this crowd, take care and be on your guard. What kind of language is that? That's military language, right? Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So take care, be on your guard. The word in the original language is actually a military term. It's a war term. He's saying take up arms, right? Go stack the towers, get arrows in your bow, get ready to go to war, because the idea is that covetousness is constantly attacking us. It is always attacking us, and we have to vigilantly defend ourselves against it, against the onslaught of covetousness. What is covetousness? What does it mean to covet? Covetousness is wanting for ourselves what God has not allotted to us. Right? It's so serious and so insidious that it's actually one of the 10 commandments. If you think about that. It's so spiritually threatening that several passages in Scripture call it idolatry. Covetousness, which is idolatry, Paul says in Colossians 3:5 and Ephesians 5:5. It becomes like it has the potential to become this false god that drives you to do things that are not good, sacrificing relationships because of your desire for stuff, or sacrificing integrity in order to get just a little bit more, or sacrificing contentment and joy because you're peering over the fence and wanting something that's not yours. All on, sacrificing these things on the altar of stuff. That's covetousness. So Jesus says, fight it all the time. Fight it. Go to war against it. Why? Verse 15, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. This is our point number one, because your life is more than your temporary things. The meaning of life is not found in stuff, not measured by, not substantiated by this temporary, hollow stuff. Possessions. I think about even that word possessions, to possess something, the things that you have, the things that you hold, the things that you keep, the things that you guard and kind of huddle, your possessions. So then Jesus tells this parable. And consider this, before we read this parable again, consider this. In Jesus' parables, if you want to tuck this away as a Bible study tool, Jesus always has an element of surprise in his parables. So as a student of God's Word, when we read a parable, we need to ask, okay, well, what is it that's a surprise in this parable? What would the original audience have been surprised by about this particular story? So read it again, verse 16. Look for this surprise. He says, and he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns. I will build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Which that phrase sounds so much like the book of Ecclesiastes. So, I mean, on the surface, it looks like the surprise would be that God calls the man a fool. But that wouldn't necessarily be a surprise for these sons and daughters of the covenant who read the Old Testament scriptures, who would have been familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes. That part wouldn't have been the surprise, that he was called a fool, or even the fact that he could die that night. The surprise would have been, I think, it would have been this, and this is what a couple of commentaries point to also. This man would have been respected in their culture. He was wealthy already, which means that he was doing something well. He was a savvy businessman. And what it looks like is that God blessed him abundantly. God gave to him more than he needed. And the way a Hebrew mind, a Jewish mind would have seen that is they would have said, God is on his side. Right? So they would have, and if he was a real person in their community, they would have said, man, God is with you. God has blessed you. You're doing something right. You get it. You get something that we don't get. And so for Jesus to then say, God said to him in verse 20, fool, that would have been the reason why they would have been shocked and thought, why would this man, how could this man possibly be thought of as a fool, right? There's not one single hint of maliciousness in this farmer. There's no cheating, there's no immorality. He doesn't gain anything dishonestly. He doesn't cheat his workers, his co-workers. He came across the wealth honestly. So he's a farmer, right? So he physically toiled. He worked hard for this. Even today, many of us in this room are in a very similar, maybe even the exact situation where you made money, you worked hard for it, you made it honestly, and then the next year, perhaps, you made even more money because of how hard you worked for it, And so you say, man, God's been so good to me. God has blessed me, or God's blessed us, our family, our household. Look how good God's been. Look how much of a blessing we have. So the surprise is that the man has a perfectly natural dilemma, that God has been kind and has provided and blessed beyond what he needs. And Jesus wants you to see how utterly normal the farmer is. I think he wants you to see you in him. He wants me to see me in him. So what's his problem? What needs to be solved? He says, I have extra stuff. I can't store it. I can't handle it. I won't need to use it immediately. I can't even spend it all at once. So what am I going to do? I'm going to bank it. I'm going to build bigger barns. Bigger savings accounts. Verse 19, and I will say to my soul, he's kind of preaching to himself here. And the word soul is actually the word psyche. In the Greek, you'll recognize that. The word, he says, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax. Take an early retirement. Eat. Drink. Be merry. So he's preaching, right? He's preaching to himself. And this phrase, eat, drink, and be merry, it was a very popular phrase in the first century Roman Empire. It was born out of a philosophy called Epicureanism. And Epicureanism has its roots in something called hedonism. And it kind of goes like this. There was something, so hedonism basically said that you need to do anything that makes you feel good immediately. And avoid anything that doesn't make you feel good. Go ahead, get drunk, eat tons of food, pursue all kinds of pleasure. Like, if you like that thing, go for it, do it. And do it to the max. Epicureans, they saw that and said, no, that's not quite right. Because we're watching people pursue pleasure to the point of death, like it's actually killing them. So there's got to be something, we're going to come up, so they came up with a more refined version of it. They said, if you want to eat the finest cuisine, but eat it at just such a level that leaves you happy and able to come back pursuing that same fine cuisine or the next fine cuisine to bring yourself the same kind of happiness over and over again. So eat, and the same, drink, be merry. Pursue these things, but pursue them in balance, but still pursue these things. The finest cuisine, drink the finest wines. That will keep you filled with pleasure without killing that pleasure and without killing yourself. And I got to say, that sounds like the American way. So what's God's conclusion? In verse 20, it says, God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you've prepared, whose will they be? It's a rhetorical question. And there's at least one answer. Whose they won't be is his, right? He's going to lose it all tonight. How often does the Bible kind of flat out call someone a fool? How often does God call someone a fool in the Bible? It's not very often. So what is a fool? The word in the Bible is a very significant word, the word fool. On one hand, it means someone who doesn't think, someone who's not processing, someone who's not being logical or careful or wise, doesn't plan. It's kind of living life imbalanced. But there's also that's the logical side, but there's also a spiritual side to it. A fool in the Bible, foolishness is not necessarily the absence of mental equipment. It's the presence of a worldview that says, this world is more urgent. This world is utterly important. Or this world is all there is. The Bible says, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. So the moment God says, this night your soul is required of you, reality kicks in. This soul that you've been preaching to, the soul that you think you've been caring for, ironically, is going to be required of you. Now, is he saying, is it foolish to save for the future? No. In fact, if you go to the book of Proverbs, which talks more than any other book about the contrast between wisdom and folly, between the wise and the fool, Proverbs will tell you over and over again to plan and to save and to be wise, to be careful and to save for the future. I think of Proverbs 21:20. It It says, the wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. Proverbs 6 says, look to the ant, O sluggard, and be wise. She prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in the harvest. So it's wise to save. But God called him a fool not because he was mindless or reckless. He called him a fool because he was godless. And how can you tell? What's Jesus' litmus for this man? What's the measuring stick? What's his thermometer to tell and to ascertain whether or not this man was being godly? It was that there was not a hint of sharing his abundance. No charity. He never said, man, I have more than I need. Let me now work to find somebody else who could benefit from the extra, from the excess that I have, who needs this, obviously, more than I do. Verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So, friends, Jesus says, don't be afraid to give it away. Don't be afraid to give up some of your stuff. Don't be afraid to give it away because your life is more than your temporary things. The reason you have what you have is to prove that God is worth more than what you have. Can I point out something that's just kind of, I feel like it's on the nose obvious, but might not be obvious when we think about this passage in regard to our own lives? I think this is really practical. You cannot be generous toward God if you keep adjusting your lifestyle to absorb the excess that he's given you. You cannot be generous toward God if you make a certain amount of money that you can live off of, and then the next year you make a little bit more, and you adjust your lifestyle, so now your lifestyle requires you to make that little bit more, and then the next year you make a little bit more, and then you adjust your lifestyle again, get a bigger house, a better car, add a few more subscriptions, Hulu, Disney Plus, and Netflix. Really? This is the American way. This is the American nightmare, right? Where we've convinced ourselves, if I make $50,000 one year, and I can get by on that $50,000, if I get a raise the next year and make $75,000, then I can breathe a little bit more, I can loosen my belt one notch, I can eat a little bit more, we can raise the grocery budget, we can raise the entertainment budget, we can raise the whatever budget, because God's blessed us. And so therefore we can live according to that new, whatever bottom line. And God gives you excess, and then you adjust your life to make it look like that you need it, and you don't. You cannot be generous toward God if you keep spending the excess that he gives you and claiming it to be your needs. I think that's pretty obvious from this passage. But how detrimental that we've bought into this. This is a life. My family needs this size house. I need this many subscriptions. I need that kind of TV. We've bought into this, hook, line, and sinker in America. And as a result, we end up becoming more anxious. We're maxing out our lifestyle, our cost of living, rather, instead of living well. The Christian way is to live well below your means. Not to figure out what you make and how you can live right up to it, how you can spend right up to it. Maybe you need to decrease your cost of living in order to increase your quality of living. I think that's point number one. Don't be afraid to give it away. If you want margin to be generous, like Jesus is calling us to be generous, give it away. Can't go home today. Cancel those subscriptions that you don't need. Go home today. Maybe look at your stuff. You could probably sell, most of us in this room could sell $1,000 worth of stuff right now, today. If you want to live the kind of rich life that Jesus is calling us to live, make margin. There's got to be margin between what you're making, what you're bringing in, and what you're actually living off of. There has to be margin. That is the Christian way. That's what the Bible has always called us to. If you go back to the book of Proverbs, you'll see that over and over again when it talks about finances. You don't live hand to mouth. You don't spend what you make. That's the way of the world. It's the way of the world. So, don't be afraid to give it away. Number one, because your life is more than your temporary things. Number two, because your Father can be trusted with your needs. Because your Father can be trusted with your needs. And this is the point of that next section, verse 22 and following. Read back into this with me. Verse 22, he says, and he said to his disciples, so he's narrowing the crowd. Back again, he said to his disciples, therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. He's connecting the first point, right? Life is more than this. Living is more than having. And then he gives three illustrations from nature. The ravens, the lilies, and the grass. Look at this. Verse 24, he says, consider the ravens. The ravens were the least wanted birds in the ancient Near East. I didn't know that until this past week. They were the scavengers. They were like our turkey vultures. They were the ravens in their day. The ravens were the least wanted, least appreciated birds in the ancient Near East. They were loud. They were annoying. Nobody really liked them. But how does God treat them? It says they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. And surely you could see the connection is to this farmer, right? They don't have storehouses. They don't have barns. They're not building bigger barns. But God feeds them. They aren't lazy. This isn't an excuse to not work or to not work hard. Birds are constantly moving, right? Building nests, looking for food, feeding their young, keeping watch, migrating hundreds of miles when they need to. Jesus never says it's wrong to work. He says it's wrong to worry. How much more valuable are you than the birds? Look at the lilies, verse 27. Go down to verse 27. He says, consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. You know, if you could have taken Solomon's most vibrant, most splendid shirt, the finest of silk maybe, if you could take that and put it under a microscope, it would look like a burlap, like sackcloth under a microscope. But if you were to take a petal of a wildflower and examine it the same way, it's breathtaking. How amazing God's ability to clothe even the lilies of the field. So well crafted and intricately designed. How do they grow? They grow like effortlessly, right? Because of God's provision. Even the grass, verse 28. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive and in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? Back then, people would make their meals in these clay ovens. They're kind of similar to India today, these tandoori ovens, these heavy clay ovens that had a hatch on them. And in fact, if you go to Israel today, like we did, you could still buy pita in some of these ovens from street vendors. What they would do is they would light a fire under the thick, heavy-bottomed clay oven. They would light a fire underneath it, but then they would light a smaller temporary fire inside of it in order to kind of speed up the process, and they get the inside of this oven nice and hot. And then they would take the dough from the pita and actually slap it onto the inside of the oven where it would bake. It would almost kind of fry and bake at the same time. But the way they would do that is by getting something. They needed some kind of fuel that would burn really hot, really fast, and burn away completely. And that's what they would do. They would take this. They would go and gather this grass, the dead grass, or they would mow the grass, clip the grass, and let it dry out for a day. And by just the next day, it would be dry enough to toss into this oven and to be used for their daily food. Fuel, fire for the fuel, Jesus says. And yet, how much more will he clothe you? it makes me think, do we trust him like that? Do we trust him as simply and plainly as the lilies of the field and the grass in our yard? When you compare, I love this. I think I've returned to this before. This statistic, when you compare a home that was built in the 1950s to a home that's built today in 2021, there are two spaces that have shrunk the most proportionately. Any guesses? What spaces, if you think of a house built in the 1950s, some of you have these houses. I have a house that was built in the around 1920. Yeah? Yeah, the living room, well, close. The dining room has shrunk proportionately, and the front porch. In many homes, there is no more front porch, because the front porch is where you used to hang out and talk to your neighbors. And we don't do that much anymore. Do you know the two spaces that have doubled in size several times over? Any guesses? Bathroom, number one. Number two? Closet. When you look at the American home today that's built in 2020, 2021, compared to the home that was built in 1950s, the closets are on average something like 14 times larger. The amount of closet space that we have in a home is something like 14 times larger. Do you think is it possible that our houses speak anything about the value system? Yeah, absolutely. So we're accruing all this crap to make us look good, and then we're going to spend all this time in another room where we're going to get looking good, right, in order to feel good about ourselves, to feel secure, to feel significant. No bird was made in God's image. No flower was ever invited into a relationship with the King of Kings. No bird was made joint heirs with Christ the King and called to him for eternity, right? No flower has a place prepared for it in heaven, in the Father's house. And if God takes care of these things as he does, will he not also take care of you? Romans 8:32 says, "He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also freely give us all things?" Do you trust him like that? Do you trust him that simply? I don't think, I would say, I know my own heart. I don't. I struggle with this. And I worry about my future. I worry about, we're sending our first kid to college next year. I have no idea how we're going to get through this. We've got 4 kids. What are we thinking? But we worry. At first, when I was studying this, tucked between the ravens and the lilies is this famous statement, "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you're not able to do it, as small a thing as that." I love that Jesus says that. Why are you anxious about the rest? When I was studying this, at first I thought, okay, so he's just pointing to how worrying is useless, which it is. Worrying is useless. It adds nothing to life. In fact, studies will prove over and over again that worrying takes away from your life, both the quality and the quantity of your days. But when you consider the context, Jesus is pointing, he's not just pointing that it's useless, but that worrying itself is godless. Look at verse 30. He says, "For all the nations of the world seek after these things." Who are the nations? How would the disciples, how would they have read this and heard this? Who are the nations? They are, in Jewish terms, they are the Gentiles. They are the non-Jewish people. And spiritually speaking, they are the godless people. They're culturally and spiritually not part of God's people. They don't believe in the king and his kingdom. They are their own providers, right? And so this is, like, these kinds of things are what they live for. That's why Jesus says this is what the nations pursue. This is what the nations seek after. The godless people seek after this. Jesus is saying, if you're anxious If you worry, if you're anxious, there's actually something that you hold in common with atheists, with godless people. Because in that moment of anxiety, in that moment of worry, you're saying, I'm not sure, I don't feel comfortable, I'm not sure that he's actually in control. I'm not sure that he's really who he says he is. I'm not sure that God is God. I'm not sure that he's got me. So I have to work. I have to be prepared. I've got to emotionally wrap myself around this thing because I don't trust him to. And if he is in control, maybe I won't like what he has for me. I'm not sure that he's good. I don't think he's going to give me what I want. So I'm going to go my own, he's got a path for me. I want to go my own path. I want to get my own stuff. And Jesus is saying, if that's you, you're being just like the godless, like the pagan nations of the world. So don't be afraid to give it away. Because your life is more than your temporary things. Because your Father can be trusted with your needs. And lastly, because your heart will follow your gifts home. I'm sorry that I've run us this far on the clock. So I would want to spend more time on this. But he points to this truth, that your heart, you send your heart ahead when you invest in kingdom causes. Your heart will follow your gifts home. Jesus gets really practical and action-oriented here. So far he's been saying, stop, don't do this, stop this, stop worrying, stop being anxious. Now he says, okay, now do this instead. Here's what you need to do. Here's the action you need to take. In verse 31 he says, instead, seek the kingdom, and these things will be added to you. It's counterintuitive, if you think about it, because according to the National Institutes of Health, where I got those statistics at the beginning of the sermon, the 3 best ways to counter anxiety are meditation, yoga, and mental exercises, they said. In other words, like emptying your mind. And Jesus says, no. Don't do that. Because your mind is an awful place. It can be. He says, instead, I want you to dedicate your mind. I want you to busy your mind, discipline your mind, and pour what you have, your energy, your focus, into pursuing my kingdom, to pursuing God's kingdom and God's righteousness. And when you get your heart and your mind on that divine level, God will do what he enjoys to do on a physical level in providing for you. So instead of seeking what the Gentiles seek, let your eyes first be drawn to things that are attractive to him. Seek those things first. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Create that margin. Lord, we have so much to praise you for. And today we praise you for this fact that you have done everything necessary to provide for everything that we need, that we really need. And I pray, Lord, would you make us into a people who value margin, into a people who value generosity, into a people who seek opportunities to say no to our flesh in order to say yes to you and to be able to pursue you and to give to others, to care for those with what you've given us. I pray, Lord, would you make that possible? Make us a people that would live this truth well. I ask this in the name of our generous Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave to us, our God gave to us the kingdom. I ask this in his name. Amen.